Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian for the Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center. And today we have another historian joining me. We're very fortunate to have Jim Rice join us. He is the Walter S. Dickson Professor of History at Tufts University and chair of the History Department. And he's going to talk about a book that has extreme local interest for us here. It's called Nature and History in the Potomac Country, From Hunters-Gatherers to the Age of Jefferson. So Jim, thanks so much for coming out to talk about your book.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you out here, and you open up in the introduction saying this is going to be an environmental history of the Potomac Country, and some people may not be familiar with the field. What does it mean to be an environmental history?
Well, environmental historians are interested in the relationships between humans and non-human nature over time. And of course, people in lots of academic disciplines are interested in that. Yeah. People in natural history don't completely ignore people. Cultural, people in cultural ecology, housed in anthropology departments do, and so forth. But history was really not well known for its attention to forces at work beyond human will, human volition, until really the 1970s. There were exceptions. There's a backstory there, but as a field, environmental history really blossomed in the 1970s. And if you're thinking this might have something to do with the Cuyahoga River burning and the establishment of the EPA and so forth, you would be right. Certainly, historians, like anyone else in the world, have things appear on their radar when they're really relevant. And the historical profession had been founded at a time when there was a lot of confidence in Western societies in mankind's ability to conquer nature, to transcend nature, and so forth. But by the 1970s, people were, of course, giving that another thought and really better understanding that a sustainable future for humanity depended on thinking more seriously and responsibly about their relationship with the rest of nature. And so historians, of course, were part of this movement. So in the 1970s, the American Society for Environmental History was founded, and academic chairs started to be established and so forth. And it's been a real growth field for about 40 years. It's not a completely united field. There are people who, for example, are essentially art historians and who are looking at 19th century landscape paintings or 18th century needlework. And then there are people who are interested in movements. So people who are interested in, for example, Richard Nixon and the environment, to cite a sort of path-breaking book from 25 years ago. And then there are people like myself who are really materialists at heart, who are very interested in non-human nature as an actor in human affairs. So we're interested in, agriculture, the rise of agriculture. We're interested in how, particular landscapes shape human societies and vice versa, this interplay. And so we are interested in what kind of trees actually are in a watershed and what possibilities that raises or forecloses for human societies. So that's the third kind of environmental history, is this materialist variety.
And it comes across quite nicely in the book. What will grow here, and why do people live here and not here?
Yeah.
Your book, interestingly, for a history book, since most people assume with history we know how the story ends, yours starts out with a question.
It does.
About habitation. Tell us a little about the hook.
It does. I really backed into writing this book, and in fact backed into doing any kind of environmental history. I think I was predisposed to do environmental history. I was raised in California in the 1970s, was a Sierra Club member. I still have my patch on my backpack that says Sierra Club. And so I was predisposed, but that wasn't what I studied. I had written a book manuscript on Greater Pennsylvania, as it's known. So this region of the interior of central Pennsylvania, western Maryland, and the Shenandoah Valley here in Virginia and West Virginia.
Yeah.
And what I was doing was really looking at the question of how it was that a really diverse society in the 18th century came to be, by the 19th century, pretty homogeneous. In the 18th century, this region was filled up very rapidly with German speakers, who tended to be highly local and speak mutually unintelligible dialects and be from radically different religions that in fact hated each other, and also with Irish and Scots-Irish settlers. And so I knew that in the 18th century there'd been really high crime rates and a lot of strife you could trace in the court records and so forth. And so I wrote this whole book and I submitted it to a press, and the referee in academic journal presses, you have sort of an outside expert who is supposed to be anonymous and will review this manuscript and tell the unvarnished truth about it. And so the referee said, well, it's good, but I don't like the organization. What I had done was organize the chapters thematically. So I was interested again in how this really diverse society became so homogenous. And so I had a chapter on county court days. I had a chapter on Sundays and this sort of thing. And so this external reviewer, he says, well, you need some chronological specificity here.
Historians are like that.
Yeah. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll go back to when Europeans show up in this greater Pennsylvania area in large numbers, which is really in the second half of the 1730s. And then it just occurred to me, why would it be the 1730s and not the 1630s? Maryland is founded in the 1630s, Virginia in 1607. And I'd lived for a long time in this region, spent a great deal of time in the Piedmont and valleys. I'd taught, for example, in Frederick County, Maryland, for a year, and I knew these roads really well. And so I knew that corn grows really well here. I know the fishing is good, the hunting is good. I understand that there are even deer hunting days right here on the grounds.
Exactly.
The training center.
And you can fish here too.
Yeah, exactly. So why would English colonists hesitate to move into the interior? And so, to make a long story short, the short answer to this was that there were native people who had some say in this. And in fact, the interior above the fall line, above today's Washington, D.C., while much used and much traveled, was not home to very many year-round native settlements. And the reason for that is that during the summertime months, late spring and summertime months, when most native warfare took place, this was a crossfire zone. This was not a safe place to situate a village. And that was true for English people as well as for native people. And so then I had to ask, well, why this is? And so, to make a long story short, I started reading archaeological reports, looking at who lived where and when and why. And I found myself back in reading site reports from the 2nd century AD and with no book. And so I kind of turned around and faced from forward instead of working backwards, and I asked myself, well, what does all this stuff I've been looking at have in common? What can archaeological evidence, which I'd been using heavily, obviously, for, say, the 8th century, have in common with government reports written back to London in the 1760s? And the answer was that all of these could tell us something about the ways in which people lived upon the land. It could be the framework, the underpinning for an environmental history.
And it's a fascinating one. And in fact, you've chosen a bigger challenge than most environmental historians, because there's no government statistics. Or there are at the end of your book, but not for the first 800 years or so. And actually, one of the people you referenced, Stephen Potter, has been out here a couple times talking about that, some of the challenges. But give us a sense, the book really does this well. Before 1607, what was the native lifestyle here? And of course, you break the Potomac Country into 3 distinct regions too, and maybe tell us if there were different lifestyles in those 3 different areas.
Well, they did vary by region, but they also varied over time. And so, the book really gets going in a serious way in about 700 AD, at which point the variations are really highly localized. The title the word hunter-gatherers is in the title, but it could be fisher-gatherers, it could be oyster-gatherers. And, it even depended upon the year, it depended on your gender. And so one of the key points from around 700 AD, before the advent of the widespread adoption of agriculture based on maize, is that hunter-gatherer societies are actually really complex. Archaeologists have a technical term, complexity, but it doesn't, and it refers to actually the way people govern themselves.
Yeah.
Complexity in a nutshell means hierarchical, but it shouldn't be taken to mean that hunter-gatherer life was not complex. You try it.
Yeah.
No, I mean just really knowing
I try
where
it every
to
day at
go
lunch.
and when. Exactly. So in 700 AD, that three-part division between the interior above the fall line, the inner coastal plain where it's tidal but not saline,
Right.
and the outer coastal plain where it's tidal and saline waters, it didn't mean quite so much. What really meant a lot was exactly where you were located, exactly where your range was. But starting in about 800 AD, you start to get infiltration of maize, a particular variety of maize that had found its way from what is now the American Southwest, that had a shorter growing season, that was suited to shorter growing seasons of the eastern woodlands. And people started to experiment with it. And so then you start to see some variations between these three main regions, because maize, corn does grow better in some settings than in others. It doesn't grow so well on mountaintops. Deer hunting is good there. It doesn't grow quite as well in the outer coastal plain where you have a lot of sandy soils. Actually, the issue there is more the drainage in the soils. So it grows there, but not as well as on the inner coastal plain and the Piedmont. So you start to get this regional separation. And now people don't just leap into agriculture. We know the end of the story, but we shouldn't confuse the end of the story with the beginning of the story. There are good reasons not to commit yourself to too heavily to any one food crop, right? Because what if that fails? There's something called Liebig's Law or Liebig's Law. I can never remember if the I or E comes first. But in a nutshell, it means that what really regulates a population of any species is the food resources at their lowest. And so what this means for humans is that, perhaps relying on maize and related crops like beans and squash on average will give you more calories. You don't eat on average. You need to eat every single year, right? And so a failed crop, the possibility of a failed crop really puts you out on a limb. And so at first, cultivated plants, particularly maize, beans, and squash, are used to diversify native economies in this region, not to simplify them. But there's a bit of a cycle here because these three varieties of crops are really calorie rich. They're not perfect for human nutrition, but used together, they can help to grow a population pretty substantially. And a larger population is a stronger population, economically, militarily. And so what happens is that by about 1300, a lot, not all, but a lot of native people in the Chesapeake Bay region, and especially in the Potomac Basin, had really reached the point where they were no longer societies with some agriculture, but were agricultural societies where a lot was built around agriculture, their ceremonies and so forth. And so that was fine and good, except that also in the 1300s, there was a major climactic shift throughout the North Atlantic, what we know now is the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age, of course, was not truly an ice age. No. The glaciers did not again descend into Pennsylvania. But what it meant was that on a sporadic basis, growing seasons shortened. And so in many places where people had committed to agriculture, especially in upland areas or areas further north, such as today's western New York, the growing season grew short enough that it created food insecurity and people started to go on the move. And they started to look for new village locations. And very often they looked to this region, where again, corn grows great, the fishing is good, the hunting is good. There are a lot of wetlands, especially below the fall line, where there are important medicinal plants and tubers and so forth that can be used to supplement the diet. And so, but these village locations were already taken. And in essence, this great movement of people, roughly to the south or downhill, throughout the 14th century, the 15th century, and the 16th century, led to this intensifying competition for prime village locations, which meant that in many cases, no one got to live in those locations.
Which is the interesting part. They didn't
Yeah.
just conquer and
Yeah.
resettle, but they
Yeah.
depopulated.
Exactly. So by the end of the 16th century, there were only a few permanent year-round villages above the fall line, really in the bulk of the Potomac Basin, because of course a river basin is funnel-shaped, right? And so most of the square mileage of the Potomac Basin is in the mountains and valleys. And it was precisely here that there were so few village locations. And in fact, those town locations that there were mostly Susquehannock people who were refugees from the north themselves.
Okay.
So so what happened then was by the time the colonists showed up in the 17th century, there was this vast buffer zone that it wasn't a no man's land. It wasn't like you couldn't go there. You just couldn't live there year round, and you couldn't count on getting a crop in there.
It answers one of our 2-decade-old questions here, because as a federal facility, we did an archaeological study, and everything indicated there were temporary fish camps and hunting here, but nothing permanent, at least as far back as we went. And you finally explained why, in that it was warfare and the tenuous existence here that made it hard. Because otherwise it makes no sense. It is rich soil and fish and hunting. Fascinating stuff.
Well, it was still a key resource center.
Yeah.
So people from below the fall line, where villages actually continued to thrive and in fact got bigger during the Little Ice Age, they would come up here for rhyolite deposits, which they used for stone points. They would come up here for materials for their ceramics. They would come up here in the late fall and the winter, hunting, spring fishing, which was critically important because springtime is the hungriest time of year.
Yeah.
The deer are kind of mangy and lean, not such good eating. Crops from the previous year, you know, kind of run out. You're saving your seed. You're not going to eat that. And so the interior, the so-called uninhabited interior, was very much inhabited and used for these critically specific uses. So there are even instances where people who I found in the 18th century where people crossed paths who, in the wintertime, and they basically set up camp with each other or next to each other. But if they met each other in the summertime, they would all be warriors and they would be trying to kill each other. So this wasn't even a crossfire zone in November. Yeah. Just in those critical summer months when the crops would have been in the fields.
We see that written on the landscape up here. We still have, this part of the Potomac had stone fishing weirs. Yeah. So they're huge and they persisted, and during low water levels, you can still see them. And they're big. They clearly were done to catch a lot of fish. And of course the fish makeup, as you point out in your book, was quite different back in the pre-European settlement time. Yeah. 1607, English settlers come to Jamestown. Surprisingly, things don't change all that much for the first couple of decades. Why is that?
Well, and certainly not on the Potomac River.
Yeah.
They don't even change that quickly in the vicinity of Jamestown. I think, again, people tend to confuse the end of the story with the story itself. And so there are very few Englishmen. We know that in some cases they brought epidemic diseases that native communities had not encountered before. Right. And that was deadly when it happened for native people, but of course they, Europeans could not have communicated those diseases had they not suffered from them themselves. And so when smallpox came through, or malaria, which was probably brought from multiple locations ranging from the county of Kent in England to West Africa, these affected English colonists as well as native people. Right. And so for a very long time, until about, I would guess about 1638, 1639, just from looking at the censuses, Native Americans outnumbered Europeans in Virginia. And that was true even longer in Maryland. It was true even longer in the Potomac Valley. So part of this was just a matter of population. Part of this was a matter of high death rates even among colonists. So that by the 1650s, there was one point during the English Civil Wars, which had sort of complicated life everywhere English people lived in the 1640s and 1650s, there was one point where there were only a handful more people in the colony of Maryland than had landed
Yeah, I was
in
struck by that, like
1634.
less than 200 or so.
Exactly, yeah. After all these years,
Yeah.
After 20 years, the population has grown by something like 70. And so that's not exactly an existential threat to 7,000 people in a paramount chiefdom, a chain of small chieftaincies in what is now Maryland, headed by one paramount chief named the Tyak. There's like 7,000 people within this paramount chiefdom and on the other side of the Potomac River in what is now Virginia, and 200 Englishmen. So it's really kind of, people tend to, I think, jump the gun and exaggerate the ease with which the conquest took place.
What changes after the 1650s that switches the demographics? So suddenly the settlers become a greater percentage of the population.
Yeah, well, environmental factors figure in here as well. The shock troops for the English are pigs, horses, and cattle, which roam in the woods. Hogs will come home. You just if you feed them once, they'll know where to find the food again. And so they can just browse in the forest for mast. Horses, they can do the same thing. Cattle doing the same thing. But guess what? If your farmstead is within a couple of miles of a native village, surrounded by cornfields, after a while they're going to learn to walk right past these tree crops and go straight for the cornfield. And then this led to strife, this led to violence, and English colonists found a way to blame native people for
the invasives they brought over.
Exactly, yeah. And so there would be some strife, and then the governor would call out the militia, and there would be a small war, there would be bloodshed. Very often, the actual troops, the militia, attacked not so much native people as their fields. There are a couple of great quotations, well, great sobering quotations, but really telling quotations from the 1620s when an earlier process, when the same process had taken place near Jamestown in Virginia, where Jamestown officials called these harsh visits and feed fights. And so essentially what they would do is attack the cornfields, try to engage the male warriors, militarily, but let the women and children run into the woods because, who does the farming in these native societies? It's actually the women. So, and they're going to have to come back and, plant again the following spring, and it's going to make them vulnerable to English attacks. So, there's a little bit of this, sleight of hand that actually anyone knows who has had, a family vacation with siblings, right? You provoke someone to poke you, and then you say, she poked you, wow. But except that it's actually deadly serious. And the other thing is that eventually, really dreadful diseases did visit native communities. Very often smallpox. It didn't happen right away. Early environmental historians in the 70s and 80s kind of popularized this notion that, English people would show up and basically
everybody dies.
Everybody dies, right? They could have wandered up and been, completely nice about everything and said, "Oh, we just noticed you have this continent here. We don't really want to, upset you in any way, but we'd like to have some sort of cultural exchange. Please shake my hand," and then everyone would die. And so I'm kind of exaggerating, but that was the sense you got from the literature on these epidemics that crossed the Atlantic. Diseases don't really work that way. So smallpox, for example, would normally burn through a ship's crew within about 2 weeks, which is not, which is only gets you to about the middle of the Atlantic. So it took some doing actually for these epidemics to cross the Atlantic. But when they did, the effects were horrific, and you start to get some a kind of a series of epidemics. Some smallpox, certainly influenza. Malaria becomes endemic in the Potomac by about the 1650s. Malaria, depending on the variety, kills somewhere between 5 and 20% of the people it affects in the 17th century, but it weakens them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
It's called the Great Debilitator. And so this really weakens Native communities. And so this is where colonialism comes in. Because when smallpox visited an English village, the death rate would be quite high. But Piscataway Indians didn't show up and destroy their fields and attack them, right, at the same time, right? So essentially, English people waited until Native communities were down, and they kicked them while they were down. And so this really got going in a serious way in the 1650s. And really the big push, again, using environmental warfare is from then through the end of the 17th century.
We're here in Shepherdstown, and there's a interesting part of your book talking about this part of the country, Hagerstown, Martinsburg, Shepherdstown, Winchester, developing towns as the European population increases, in part as a result of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. Tell us a little about that.
Well, the story starts a little bit earlier.
Okay.
It goes back to the 1720s.
Okay.
In the second half of the 17th century, through these forces I've already described, the native population of the Potomac Valley really did drop quite a bit. And it became such a hostile, dangerous place for Native people to live that a lot of people from these communities in the lower Potomac ended up taking refuge in the north, on the Susquehanna River and amongst the Haudenosaunee, the Five Nations Iroquois, in what is today New York. And so at this point, English people could have started to move into the interior, except that, as I said, they can also be attacked by these raiders from the north. And these refugees from the Potomac Basin, when they settled into Haudenosaunee communities, such as the Onondagas, when they were talking about like where a war party might go, they'd say, I have a good place to go. And so, and because there's a lot of bitterness, and so it made it all that more dangerous for English people to move into the interior. And so what happens is there's a series of treaties between the governments of Virginia and Maryland on the one hand, and the Five Nations on the other, starting in 1722, that open up, that kind of divide the interior. For example, the 1722 treaty says, well, the English have to stay east of the mountains, east of the Blue Ridge, east of Catoctin Mountain, so in today's Piedmont area, roughly defined by U.S. Highway 15 in the west. And so these two English governments say, great. And then 14 years later, they're saying, well, not so great. We want the Shenandoah Valley too. And so there's another treaty in 1736. And there's not a lot of agreement amongst Haudenosaunee people over whether these treaties are valid or a good idea. And so there's still a lot of strife in the backcountry. But this does make it possible for English governments to say, well, we have a treaty, this is now our land. And so the other thing that's been delaying the settlement of the interior, resettlement, of the interior, is that English law of property had previously been a weapon for dispossessing Native people. They'd say, to a Native person, well, show me your deed. Let's go to the county courthouse. Where is it, right? And there's like this magical power to having a survey map, a plat, and but in order to survey property, a new property, and get a deed from the provincial government, the government had to have title to that land in the first place. And so until these treaties in 1722 and 1736, and some more later, the governments of Virginia and Maryland didn't feel confident enough to grant those lands. But wait, it gets more complicated because I only named two sort of granting agencies. Maryland and Virginia couldn't agree on where the Potomac River was because it has the southern branch, which we now know as the Shenandoah Valley. Pennsylvania and Maryland couldn't agree on where their border was. That wasn't settled until this famous Mason-Dixon survey, dated roughly to 1760. And so that's pretty complicated, right? So that means that you would have areas in the interior that all three colonial governments laid claim to. In some cases, were giving land grants to that naturally overlapped. But wait.
It's more complicated.
It's more complicated than that, because a big chunk of Virginia, known as today as the Northern Neck, the region between the Potomac and the Rappahannock Rivers, had been granted to a royal favorite and named Fairfax, Lord Fairfax, which is why we have Fairfax County and so forth. And so Fairfax and the governor of Virginia contended over where the Northern Neck ended, how far west it went, how far south it went, which branch of the Rappahannock was the real boundary, and Fairfax contended with Maryland as well. So as a consequence, there is a little patch of land near the mouth of the Monocacy that, as best as I can tell, was actually granted at roughly the same time, in the same couple of decades, by Pennsylvania, by Maryland, by Fairfax, by Virginia. And farmers can't live with that confusion, right? They're investing their whole lives, really, in clearing fields and putting up walls, building barns, and they want to know, do I live in Maryland or do I live in Pennsylvania? Right. And so this confusion really delays for quite a long time resettlement of certain areas of the backcountry, so that until the Mason-Dixon line was drawn, you can actually, if you map where people lived, or at least where they were taking out land patents, there's actually what appears to be this vacant sort of DMZ between what is now Pennsylvania and Maryland, where people were just hesitant to do anything except sort of squat on the land because they might end up losing the land when they find out they're not in
like my hometown of Hagerstown.
Precisely. That's a very good example, yeah.
Part of the richness of the book is the depth and the understanding of all these complex political factors. And you made a nice observation early in the book about how Native Americans and English settlers had totally different concepts of surveys and boundaries and maps. Tell us a little how they looked at you. You mentioned at one point the Native American did a map with pine cones, basically showing their settlements.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to overstate this because in many instances, Native communities had very firm ideas of where the boundaries were.
Sure.
Of lines you could not cross without certain obligations or risks, right. And so forth. So I don't want to overstate that. But in this region, English people were very interested in the outer boundaries and surveying those outer boundaries correctly. There were some exceptions, like if they were looking at tobacco land on the lower Potomac, they were more fastidious about surveying lands on low-lying areas where they actually grew the tobacco, right. And less fastidious about surveying the land on the ridgetop where they were maybe just cutting timber for construction and so forth. But they went to great lengths, and their governments went to great lengths to get those lines exactly right. Yeah. You could have lawsuits that would go on for decades over where that line was.
Sure.
Whereas in an adjoining native town, people were more concerned about the centers. Again, they weren't unconcerned about boundaries. There's the edge of my field, but
different focus.
But they were more concerned about the center of where you fished. Yeah. What is my fishing place? Where do people from my kin group go to, gather tuckahoe roots and this sort of thing? So, yeah.
You're absolutely right. We have stone boundary markers that are, 200 years old.
Yeah.
Here, but they're the outer boundaries.
Yeah.
Not this is, this is my well or so on.
And theoretically, in English law and practice, when you had a plat, it was empty space. It didn't really matter what was in it. Now, that's theoretically. You can tell by purchase prices and so forth what value people put on what was in it. And people did buy, say, an established farm because it already had a well and so forth. But in theory, this was an empty space. It didn't matter what was at the center.
The most famous surveyor, obviously, of this part of the country was Washington.
Yeah.
Tell us about Washington's impact on the Potomac.
Well, I think people in Alexandria feel that most acutely.
Yes.
He was very much, you can still see his, you can still look at online at his hand-drawn surveys of the town.
Mm-hmm.
But it certainly extended further than that because he was a young man surveying in the Shenandoah Valley. And this really was his first career. Famously, he had a diverse array of economic activities, a lot of which did not work out so well. Consistently, from what I've been able to tell, and a George Washington expert might gainsay this, but from what I've been able to tell, his most consistently successful economic endeavors were a shad fishery that he had the rights to off of Mount Vernon, and his surveying work as a young man.
Yeah. Your next project is even bigger than the Potomac Country, which, how many miles is Potomac Country?
14,000 and change square miles.
As if that, over 1,000 years, was not big enough. Tell us what your next project's going to be.
Well, at first I should say that I did a sort of a palate cleanser for a book in between. I really wanted to write on a more intimate scale.
Is that Bacon's Rebellion?
And so, yeah, and so I wrote a narrative history of Bacon's Rebellion, this civil struggle within Virginia that really tore the colony apart in 1675 and 1677, and really continued to have repercussions for another 20 years. But 20 years compared to 1,000 years,
yeah.
that's pretty manageable. So,
right.
So I really did want to be able to be specific and have dialogue and so forth. And so, but yeah, so now I've turned to another book that is really very big picture. I'm working on a title.
We don't want to pressure you there, but it's exciting global.
It's an environmental history of native North America, from Oaxaca, really from the Mayan Peninsula to the Arctic, and from the first human habitation to the present. And it's going to be shorter actually than my Potomac River book, so it's going to be 90,000 words, which is less than 200 pages.
We'll try to get you back for that. But I have to ask you one other question before we let you go and get ready for your talk tonight. You're the chair of the history department at Tufts, so you see a lot of history majors coming through your institution and through Boston in general. What are the job outlooks for history majors?
Pretty good, pretty good. There are a lot of people throw around cliches pretty freely about humanities majors, and humanities faculty have answers for a lot of these cliches. They'll tell you that humanities majors, the salary gap, for example, between people with humanities degrees and STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, does narrow the older people get. So humanities degrees prepare you for your second, third, and fourth career. Humanities faculty and advocates will also tell you that the movement, famously, people have left the philosophy major, the English major, the French major for other majors. Well, they're not going into STEM disciplines. They're actually going into psychology. They're going into econ. They're going into the social sciences. And, just purely on a career basis and dollars and cents basis, the gap between people in the social sciences and the humanities is not that great to start with.
Right.
And it too tends to narrow. So that's what they'll tell you. We have a big review of our department coming up. It's mandated every 10 years by the regional accrediting agency, and as part of that, we've been really taking a hard look at where our alumni go, and it really does bear out what people say about the long-term career and other paths that people take with their history majors. So. It's not exactly anecdotal. We're being as exhaustive as possible.
Yeah.
There is a bias here against people who don't want to be found.
Right.
So we're not really finding I don't know if we have criminals amongst our graduates,
Sure.
They're laying low. But we're finding a surprising number of MDs that were that majored in history at Tufts. We're finding naturally that, a lot of people go into academia, but a lot of people go into nonprofits, NGOs. We found a couple of documentary filmmakers, and we've found I don't know, just some surprises. And that's the thing about humanities majors. They really do prepare you to be adaptable, to be flexible, to really bear down and learn a lot about something very quickly, to be very proactive and training yourself and retraining yourself. So, you know, some people have taken paths that I would not have anticipated. I wouldn't tell parents that your kid is going to get a history major at Tufts and, as I recently discovered, become co-CEO of Warby Parker.
Can't guarantee that.
Yeah, there are only two if it's a co-CEO.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I also discovered in digging around recently that Tufts history major from, I guess, the 90s is now the host for Turner Classic Movies. Again, send your kid to Tufts. We can't guarantee
Right.
that particular job, but we can guarantee that you'll have people who have earned a real education. That's not, it can be a narrow technical education depending on what research path a student takes, but it doesn't have to be. You know, they will be good generalists. They'll be inquisitive. They'll be able to read a mountain of books very quickly.
Yeah.
They'll be able to communicate well.
Well, I think we have two historians here that have had a rich and fulfilling careers since they got their history degree. So it's nice to end on that positive note. So Jim, thank you so much for coming out here. Thanks for your wonderful book on the history and environmental history of the Potomac Country. And we're very much looking forward to your talk tonight.
Okay, thanks again for having me.
And thank you for tuning in.